20 years ago, this would be a talk about anti-racism. 10 years ago, this would be a talk about white supremacy. I think 5 years ago, this would be a talk about the preciousness of Black lives, Indigenous lives, as a representation of all life. And I think today, I'd like to speak with you all about the necessity of ancestral and cultural healing among people who benefit from whiteness. And part of my journey starts with this short story. I'm based in DC. I was actually born in DC and raised near DC most of my life, and have a background as an organizer, as a people's lawyer, and as a spirit worker. And about 3 years ago, a dear friend from Black Lives Matter DC was speaking to me over tea. And he's like, Rochelle, I gotta be honest with you. We were so excited about this moment in Washington, DC, where there's so many people who are finally connecting to the suffering that I feel and people that I care about feel every day. And in particular, I'm so excited that there are white folks who are coming out and have our backs and are supporting us and loving us like never before. And despite their best intentions, there are so many people who are coming out in solidarity, but are causing us harm. That are causing us to be even more afraid. Who, even in this solidarity and deep love, are still learning how to love us. And we need spaces for them to learn how to connect to themselves so they can help better connect to us. And I was like, I think I'm your person. I think I can help. So, for me, when I think about reweaving the web and what that means in my own body, what that represents, is a way of reconnecting more deeply to the ecosystem that sustains us. And what I think that means in a broader context is that each of us can be more deeply connected to all parts of ourselves as a template to being connected to all parts of life. And metaphor often could be our language for the things that are so complex, are so dense, they're so mysterious, that we need to speak in that language first before we understand its meaning. And for me, this is an understanding about how we are in interbeing. I'll only say a few short words what I think about what this means. In part, Hillary mentioned you've been talked at most of the day, or you've been in talking space for most of the day. So I'd like to share just a little bit about where I'm coming from and some of the framework around this idea of human ecology. And then I'd love to share this Q&A with you all about what that means for you all. And I have plenty of questions that we can be an exploration with. So I think many of us are very aware that there's a global shift that's taking place. And for me, this shift is a representation of a great rebalancing that's taking place at all the levels of which we know: spiritual, emotional, psychic, cosmic, ecological. And we know, I believe, that this is probably more or less like the beginning, if we understand time that way. But these shifts are notable. Some ways they're rapid, and some ways they're slow. And ultimately, I believe that this rebalancing is going to involve our reconnection, but also the humanization of all people and all life. And that includes even kind of this assertive reorganization of justice. toward oppressed peoples and also the undervalued parts of ourselves. So in my ecology, we understand communities, but we also understand parts of ourselves as needing justice. And in some cases, that's synonymous with healing. And I think we can expect that there are going to be deep reactions toward this loss, right? As we rebalance. Naturally, there's going to be grief, there's going to be resentment, there's going to be anger, there's going to be many things. And that's regardless of whether you believe it's necessary. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a reality we should embrace. And that we should also assume that in one way we are well-resourced and well-prepared, and in another way that our current systems, at least, and our institutions, the things that we've created, weren't designed to adapt with this shift. And that's all right, too. And in fact, many of them were actually designed, right, against our ecologies, right? So they're being reorganized. So to me, the wisdom and medicine of our time is about that reconnection to ourselves, new relationships with one another, and also reclaiming our interbeing, which is another way of understanding interdependence. So if we use analogy or metaphor, I'm really thinking about some of these core values. And I'm thinking about these core values in terms of the toxins and antidotes. So it's my belief through my experience that we're part of ecosystems. We experience the toxin of individualism, and the antidote is collectivism, cooperation. And we must ask ourselves, when and how did we unlearn collectivism? How do we isolate ourselves? And what has land and other nature taught us about cooperation? I believe that we are in order, that the toxin is any other kind of complex that we can save something, that we have to martyr to be okay. The antidote is addressing the ways in which this ecosystem that we have influence over causes harm. And which parts of yourself would be in better order if you were more skillfully fulfilled your role within the ecosystem? I believe that we must be in relationship. That the toxin of distrust of other members of our ecosystem runs deep, and the antidote is to build deep relationships with all members of our ecosystems. And this begs the question of when and how did we unlearn to trust certain people in our ecosystems? And I say this from a person in a black body. I believe that we are complex by design. That the toxins are dichotomies, reductionism, singularity, and that we have these rich antidotes of gradients, of nuance and contexts. And we have to ask ourselves how we avoid ambiguity in our lives. How do we oversimplify? How do we avoid context? And we're back to resources. I believe that we are well resourced. That the toxins of scarcity or the belief that more is better impacts us often negatively. And that the antidote is abundance and understanding of those essentials, as shared by Alice Walker. So how much energy do we devote to gaining more resources than what we need? In which ways do we hoard surplus? And how and where else can we shift our energies? What else can we share? I believe that we are better in consensus. But the toxins of paternalism and power hoarding are old paradigm. And in this new paradigm, we're looking at the antidotes of horizontal knowledge. This is why this will be short. And power sharing. So how can you redesign your own life to share more power? Finally, but maybe not the most important, I do believe that we must take risks to survive and thrive. So the toxin of comfort culture, of complacency, can be replaced by antidotes of adaptation and being change expectant. And this might be the core question for me that I ask myself every day. What does it take for you to transform? The last thing I'll say before opening up the conversation is I've been in rich learning over the past few months. The evolution of the workshop at Centre Ashe, which was last winter, has become actually a virtual community called Human Ecology Racism, called HER, and that's very purposeful. And in participating as HER, there are about 70 folks who've joined me in this experiment for 6 months to see if we can unlearn the cultural dynamics around whiteness, which harms everybody. This exploration has taken us from tracing back some of our generational loss to our most recent space where we had the opportunity to look at the shadow self of guilt and where that leaves us stuck and drained, unable to more deeply connect to the suffering that's beneath and that requires our attention. I've been humbled by the courage in that class, the honesty, when folks actually had a space to express themselves, and the complexity that we can naturally draw out from our own experiences. So this work of liberation isn't easy. And there's nothing else more important to do. So I'll open up with this general question, but I would love to just be in conversation with whatever resonates in this space. But I have this deep curiosity about how other parts of our ecosystems has taught us about connection, relationships, and interbeing. And how these relationships are transforming our lived experiences around this question of racial justice. There are many layers to that, but we can leave it right there. So,
Michelle, will you please repeat the first question?
Sure. So I'm mostly curious about which parts of your ecosystems have been teachers about reconnecting to yourself. And I mean that physically, I mean that emotionally, I mean that culturally, I mean that ancestrally, psychically.
Yeah, I'm not really answering fully directly, but you know, when you were speaking at first, everything that you were talking about, like finding that, you know, complexity within yourself, and you know, like battling those different, or harmonizing those different parts of yourself, you know, it's like really easy to like think about that in society as like a gender thing, and like in some sense it is, and then, you know, but in another sense it's like so many other layers, because just within my own self I'm, you know, taking on that challenge of, you know, the macro issue, you know, that we're dealing with, or the political issue that we're dealing with, just the surviving on Earth as humanity issue we're trying to deal with, definitely reflects my own inner journey. So yeah, I think it's complex, and I think a lot of times, like for instance, we're always talking about, white, or we're talking about like feminism, but we're not, like, how many times do you hear like a white woman saying like, that white man, and we're like totally forgetting the fact that we're white, and we're just like not addressing our own part of the puzzle, and I think it starts on an individual level.
Thanks for sharing your experience. Yeah, I absolutely believe that our ecosystems are really templates about our relationships with the world, right? So if you, or don't know yourself, or have parts of yourself that you shame or ignore, or it's all being played out externally. And to assume otherwise, I think, is just contrary to what we know of ecosystems.
Well, I'm still entertaining the possibility that the absence of melanin is a deficiency. And I'm seriously studying as much as I can find that theory in my mind. Because there is a whole body of history that could point that direction, starting with the Bible. So, to me, it will be very interesting to see what comes out of these kinds of group discussions, because whatever our confession of guilt, will it change the dynamic? Will we be able, if we find out, to say we are deficient? Something is amiss. And that will be, I hope, I be long enough alive to see that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important curiosity. And I've been increasingly making the distinction between whiteness, right, and identity around whiteness, and society's organization around whiteness, and white supremacy, from the particularity of a person, right? Even the particularity of a person who benefits from all these things. So, and I think part of that's been drawn out for me as I witness and even receive a lot of people's guilt about what I call spiritual inheritance, right? So, I think many of us know about material inheritance very well, and how that's has contributed lots of harm and inequity. And even like Karen, you talked about today about epigenetically, like we can see the ways that trauma is passed on, even in our bodies. And yet I'm not sure if I fully have declarative memory, like language, to really grasp the burden that can come with that part of the inheritance of legacy around colonialism, imperialism, or other really big things. So what I try to remind some folks about here at this moment is that we've all received an inheritance. Not any different. Hillary, you and I were talking about how you all have stored this land, right? It looks and feels very different than how you received it, right? And that's within a generation this land has been healed.
Yeah.
It's healing, and is being remade, right? Transforming. And I believe the same is true with people in our ecosystems who benefit from certain legacies. So, to me, what the particularity means is thinking about the very specific context of your ecosystem and taking responsibility for it and what you influence. To me, that's a much more, for me, that's the question that I'm currently in deep conversation with. Because if I have a theory of change around like cascading, right? I'm influencing my ecosystem and you're influencing yours, and we come together and influence bigger ecosystems. Okay. Not unlike how we see cascade effects in nature. Playing our roles. I think part of the dis-ease right now is that many of us are advocating our roles. And whether that has to do with challenging white supremacy or challenging patriarchy or challenging other forms of injustice that we know exist and sometimes understand that we benefit from. Who else wants to talk?
Okay, I hope this comes out right. I'm really into human ecology too, through like a permaculture lens. I'm just like a dork on it. I think it's really interesting. So for me, what I've found is like when things get too complex, humans get really confused as to how to like understand and then create an action as like, okay, I'm white, what do I do? Like that comes up a lot, I feel like, in these type of conversations. Or like, what should I do, you know, based off of what like a black person should tell me I should do, or what this other colored person, it gets confusing. And so for me, as like a tactic with my own ecology, it's been helpful to zoom out, like bird's eye perspective, and zoom out on humans as this like blip of stuff, trying to figure out how to be civil with each other, how to migrate, how to share and exchange culture, all of these things. And it's like outside of ego, feelings, thoughts, and history, we're like still animals that compete in nature and create these hierarchies. And it's unfortunate how that has shown itself economically in America, how it's shown itself with white opportunists. And I feel like it's true, this pattern has existed where like white culture has dominated in all of these fields. Yet I feel like it's important not to ignore all of the beauty in black and other colored cultures where they're rich. They're wealthy in certain cultures that white culture there's not much of in the same type of way, whether it's music, art, language, different types of beauty. So listening to what you're saying and trying to connect to it, which I really feel connected to a lot of what you're bringing out, trying to create conversation where y'all are still the minority in this gathering, and not to neglect that and to feel comfortable saying that, and break whatever those boundaries might have even existed so we can just be animals trying to figure out how to move forward so this hierarchy doesn't keep being so linear. But yeah, that's just my perspective, and I try to view things from an ecological way like you, because for me it takes the ego out of it. It's just humans doing this thing that they've done for years, where they compete, just like plants. And now we have the invasive species taking over, and how is that representative? That's like white flight, you know, all over the world. Anyway, I could like geek out for like 3 years about this, but you get what I'm saying, right? Okay.
Thank you. And you know, it's interesting. There's a lot you shared, which I appreciate. And thank you for sharing about where we're connecting. And it struck me too that even the ways that we interface as humans with ecology, right, also varies a lot based on just our context. So even coming from a tradition that in the diaspora is rooted in, say, like more Congolese cosmology, right? Like even some of the natural assumptions about how animals exist are different, or humans exist. There's much more like cyclical relationships horizontal relationships.
Could you say what that looks like?
Yeah. I think specifically I'm thinking about disconnection to ancestors. It's actually, I think, similar to some of the ways some indigenous nations with whom I have relationship view ancestors, which is like everything is an ancestor, right? So just the relationships between life and death seem different, right? But the cosmology is really around the nature of a circle, right? So that idea of how life exists in cycles, how we are in horizontal relationship to one another but connected, the ways in which our rhythms are connected to each other, which just means that worldview would see even the ecology and permaculture and how things happen, or might emphasize different aspects of it. I think it's interesting. So, yeah, particularity matters.
I've just been contemplating a lot this connection between, or correlation rather, between privilege and spiritual poverty. It's, there's always exceptions to the rule, but it's almost a pretty direct relationship there. And it was a realization I had, particularly being a yoga teacher in DC for about 20 years. When I first started teaching, it was pretty much like still traditions in the yoga studios. But I kind of started teaching right at the crest where it started shifting more to like a culture of fitness. And, I have a lot of respect for yoga as a mystical tradition and the healing power in it. And I found myself constantly running up against this wall where, people just wanted their latte and their yoga.
In that order.
And so, I kind of stopped being a professional yoga teacher, just taught for donations or whatever. And now, I'm really impressed to see that the students who come to my classes are very diverse. We've had 80-year-olds besides 7-year-olds, and every kind of race represented, even Indians. And I realized that if you haven't had much privilege, there's a spiritual wealth that comes there. We're able to recognize healing gems that people who had a lot of privilege, it's going to be more difficult. And it's not really the privilege, I realized, because we all have different kinds of privilege. It's the entitlement to it. And it's the entitlement that blinds us to what privileges we have and takes them for granted. And then we only are viewing in terms of how things can be useful to me. And then we miss the healing gems, we miss the presence of beautiful souls all around us. So, and that's entitlement is something I have no idea how to fight other than just continuing to connect heart to heart and being as loving as possible.
I appreciate that. That sounds like a good answer to me. Yeah, I think that we had a brief conversation in the parking lot about creating alternatives. So I think the more affirmative spaces we create like this that allow us to actually be in lived experience with one another in a different way, will continue to strip people of that entitlement at some point. They'll have another experience that challenges them. Increasingly, I think we're in a process where these affirmative spaces will be part of the cultural shift so that folks can't even avoid them as much, right? And that's going to be something to watch. That reactionary response to that deep loss, right? And we're seeing that happen in different ways now. And as you said, we all experience, privilege is too, I think, rigid of a concept even to, I think, really capture, I think, what a lot of us are describing. But because we look at our particularities and the ways in which parts of ourselves are honored in a particular way and parts of ourselves aren't, it's going to be really interesting to not only watch but be a part of. And by interesting, I mean like all the things, right? It's going to be all inspiring and the most frightening experience ever. But I think you're right, like the actual practice of being with one another in a way that orients us toward the values we actually have, like a relationship, deep relationship and intimacy and love is what we're creating.
Then you'll see it as a gain instead of a loss.
At some point, I hope. Yep. I know I do. I know you do.
We do.
Yeah.
I just want to add something very general, and it may go along with everything that is being discussed. It may not, but I think a lot of times people operate out of ignorance, and so the only antidote for ignorance is knowledge. So once you live or experience something, then you can have an understanding. And so I think that it's a lot easier to be judgmental or prejudiced about things or feel entitled unjustifiably when you have no idea, what it is that you are lacking. Does that make any sense? So I guess it's, not to get like religious, golden rule. I mean, I know that goes across the board, but I mean, it's basically like, I know it's really hard to not be judgmental, but you shouldn't unless you have lived what this other person is going through. And sometimes that's impossible, but then you never know what's going to happen down the road, and then, like, I know, like, just going through life, but there have been times when I have, like, not experienced things, and I think, oh, I never would, and then you live, and then you're like, oh, okay, I take that back, Now I understand, now I know, so it's like, the more you experience, the more you live, the more you gain knowledge, I think that's when your judgment just sheds away a little bit more. And then you can have more compassion towards others and everyone and the planet as a whole, or the universe, however far out you want to go.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that what was really important about what you just shared is you started out with awareness, which I think is important. And many of us probably have examples in our life we become aware of something, but it doesn't mean we necessarily accept it or understand it, right? So when you said the C word, compassion, I was like, hey, yes.
Yeah, I guess you have to have the will to want to have an understanding, basically. You can stay in the dark as long as you want. But once you want to come out into the light and see what's going on, then you'll get enlightened, You get answers, you get wisdom.
That's right. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of sometimes you just make up words or make up things. But I've been trying to think about what it means to actually be aware that you may not have someone's direct experience, but to draw finality to something you have experienced. And I'm using the word compassion memory to describe that. You may not have this direct experience, but you have the memory of something similar
Yep.
in this, your body, in this deep memory
Yeah.
that you can bring into some other understanding or some other context that may not be your own. And I think that's what you're getting at. Like,
Yeah, and it's, sometimes I think for a second I want to, understand a whole lot, but I know the way to get to that point is to go through things, which can be difficult and scary. So I don't pray for it a lot. I'm just going with the flow. I'm not up for too many challenges, but I'm just like, riding the wave.
yeah, but you know how to ride them, and you know to expect them, right? That's just part of existence. Absolutely. And I'm really moved to this idea of this having transformative relationships to all things, but I think particularly like people, that helps generate the will to want to experience that growth,
Right.
And I think it's not always about having one-to-one relationships, but it's about it's about, I think, a deeper commitment to being
Evolving.
To evolve and just have a willingness to go through all the things that consist of having intimacy, right? That's hard. Right? Many of us don't experience probably nearly as enough intimacy as we need because it's so hard, and yet we know it's possible and we know that's a part of ourselves.
Yeah, it's like, you want to say love is so overused, you think of charity is another good word, because you're giving of yourself. You're not giving things. It's like, that's the sincere act of love, is charity of giving of yourself, and agape, brotherly love.
I love that. Thank you. I love that image. Expanding. Yes.
I just wanted to say this really good quote that I thought of earlier today.
Uh-huh.
And I heard it a while ago. I don't remember where.
Uh-huh.
But it went, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, then the world will know peace.
Mm-hmm.
Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
Who is it? Jimi Hendrix.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you for bringing that quote. Yeah, I think that's part of the shift that we're witnessing right now. That the nature of power, as we have understood it, it's not understood it, but as we've organized our world, right, around the material power, we're seeing the delusion in that. The spiritual poverty it can offer you, and how we're all impacted by it. And I think we're witnessing how we're redefining power at this very moment. And it's exciting and scary.
Thank you so much for holding this space and for leading this conversation. I think for me, it's important to hold both, like Karen's talk earlier, and the facts around what happened and what continues to happen, and whether like we and our personal ancestors are connected to that, or whether it's just our connection is right now and the way that we continue to move through the world, and the way that we continue to propel these systems, often based out of fear of the system no longer working for us. And so I think just holding both of those things, both this like this desire for love and for intimacy and for connection, also with like the magnitude and the gravity and of what needs to change.
Right, and think of all of those who the system doesn't work for now. You know, like it's already not working. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, we can and will hold all of it. I'll let you finish.
Oh yeah, and just something that in the I appreciate the model of this of thinking about this as a balancing of ecosystem, and for me it also has a lot to do with like completely reimagining the way that I want to live, and that's really hard. It's really hard to live into a thing that we've never lived in before. And so when I think about transformation also, it's like this, it's working this muscle of imagination and of imagining something that has yet to exist and that we have to like be our way into with all of the choices and all of the ways that we are moving through the world.
Thank you for that framing. Absolutely. Yeah, it's yeah, I think that's the question of like, what does it take for you to transform? And what's going to allow you to like show up for that every day? That's a good question, right? And I ask that in my own life. I'm a Black person. I am also like a middle-class kid. And grew up with some economic insecurity, but mostly was pretty well off. So I think about my relationship to changing the systems of material wealth in our country, right? And how I'm participating in that. So, and I've done a lot of experimentation, right, in my livelihood to even see like what that looks like. So for example, with the Human Ecology of Racism course, it is an offering to anyone who's willing to sustain for 6 months. So it is a cash-based system, but you can join at any level. So some folks are joining at $5 for 6 months, and some folks are joining for $100 for 6 months. There's not even a suggested range for people to join. And I also, in this experimentation, this is like the latest of many. Like I'm into the gift economy, I'm into bartering, I'm into other forms of creative exchange that we're trying to do. But I had to think about for this particular model, how could I make an offering for what I consider like bridge curricula in between the courses that could sustain and support that work and not be based on what one's ability to pay was, right? Because I already created the system that says theoretically, if you can sustain at any level, great. And I'll mention one more note about that. But what I ended up saying is like, okay, let's have a threshold. If we can get to this number collectively, then I'll be able to do this. And folks got there. Easy. I think we got like twice that amount, right? And I think I'm probably the only person who's paying attention to that number, right? But it's happened organically. So everyone got access, right? Nobody got access or everybody got access. And the interesting thing too is that there's some folks who've had different things happen during the time of the course that have impacted their ability to offer money. And they wrote me like nervously saying like, I have to delete my account. I want to be part of the course, but this has happened, I'm sorry. And I have to withdraw. And I'm like, where are you going? And this model I call, this particular one, a solidarity economy, right? So I was like, how about this, right? Please stay. And if something changes, make a contribution or share with some friends. Just the exchange of goodwill was meaningful, right? So all of us, depending wherever we are in our context, I feel like can be leaning into that transformation, right? And it's, to me, I try to tap into a kind of creativity that makes it feel more exciting than scary most of the time. Because my other experience with transformation is when things get really bad. And then I know how to transform. But I'm trying to be more affirmative about that. And just be in kind of that creative genius, that imaginative genius that you're describing. And being playful with it. And trying to get connected that way. So I appreciate that framing you. Maybe one or two more.
Yeah, that'd be fine. And then if people are still up for it, now that it's dry, we could do a fire circle now. Now with the rain stuff. So yeah, two more.
John's already on it.
Oh, he's on it.
Up at the sacred circle.
All right. Yes.
I just want to say thank you for the invitation to have conversations, the invitation to look at one's own self, to see what part you play in not only your own personal system, but how that interplays with other systems.
Yes.
I have the joy of turning 60 this summer.
All right.
And so what you're saying really resonates with me. I was born in 58 and doing a lot of revisiting of what has impacted me over the years. One of the biggest things I notice is if you are willing to talk to people, you will find connections and the world becomes less scary. So I can't thank you all enough for being here. One of the things, I've lived in big cities. It's my first time living, it's 5 years now living in West Virginia. And where I currently live, the exposure to a multitude of different heritages is not there.
Sure.
You know? So the way that you've come in and welcomed everybody in this group and opened up the conversation is just much appreciated.
It's a pleasure because I know it's part of my role, and it's a pleasure to do it. So thanks for receiving it. That's important. It also makes it much more difficult for me. It's a very different experience doing that in West Virginia, right? Any other kind of burning contributions for our conversation?
I was just thinking of something Nicole said about whiteness being the lack of melanin. And I think of whiteness as the total lack of color. And the culture comes from Europe, where Inquisition, the killing of our medicine people, the killing of our culture, the killing of our soul. So here we are with a total lack of color, with a total lack of, we're building it as white people. We're building it. Some of it's being called appropriation, but we have to find it from somewhere because it was burned out of us. And then we took this machine that we were part of, and I'm not one of the privileged ones. I'm one of the cogs in the wheel that's just turning around, and you start to wake up. You're born and raised as this cog, and you slowly realize you're in this big machine that's destroying races and nations and cultures, and it's really hard, first of all, to find a soul, and it's also real hard to jump out of that machine because there's that no man's land you got to run across.
That's rich.
Both as a white person and as a male, there's a no man's land to cross.
Yes, I think I understand you better. Yeah, so the same. Obviously we're at different purposes, but like I said, as conjure is a tradition that's about reclamation for me. I feel like the project of reclamation, right, from descendants of Europe, is the work, right? And I think we might see things differently about what was lost or destroyed, right? I think that, so if after, like, those of you who had the honor of listening to Karen and hear about the terrorism of United States in chattel slavery, right? If that can be reclaimed, I feel like most things can be reclaimed, right?
Okay,
So I'm sure you know, with that imagination, right? I feel like, I mean, there's a lot of richness in European histories, right? And there's other things, but this soul, I don't think is lost. The reclamation part, though, I know is very uncharted, right? Because the very purpose of the system of white supremacy was to disconnect. So it might feel super distant and at times totally lost, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful in part through the imagination of traditions from which my bloodline is a part of in this lifetime. But I'm also hopeful because, like, it's y'all the answer, right? Like, all the healing work that you all are doing, all the work you have in terms of relating to one another differently, of coming together as community, in this deep understanding of interbeing and interdependence means that me and Karen get freer. And I'm cool with that. Right? You get freer, we get freer. This land gets freer. So I'm hopeful, and I'm also deeply grateful that you all are doing this work with me. So we'll end with that so we can move into Sacred Fire. I'll be here for a little bit longer and we can continue to be in conversation. Thanks for being open, y'all.
Thank you.